Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on a topic that's both timely and critical. Does mental health really matter at work? My name's Rod Hutchings from Melbourne, Australia. I'm an Air Force officer, a mental health first aider. I'd just like to start the panel with a little bit of a quote that I think is quite relevant. We're not machines. We need rest. We need time. We need space. We need laughter. We need love, and perhaps most importantly, we need each other. So I think the quote sets a good foundation for our conversation today. So if we can bring forward the panelists for the discussion. And again, good morning, afternoon, evening to yourself, and really looking forward to our discussion today. So let's just start the discussion. If we can introduce yourself and maybe just share with our audience just what has you really passionate about this topic. And if we go around clockwise and start with Nessa, thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nessa Johnson. I've been in the people field for over 20 years. I've decided that I'm only going to stop at 20 and only say over 20 from here on out. So just for the record. And, I'm really passionate about mental health in the workplace, just based on my own journey with mental health. And then having really a ringside view of how mental health can impact people at major moments in their employee journey. So I know, and I take great responsibility that my role can really shape how people experience the workplace and how that impacts their mental health. So I'm excited to be here today.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Angela Bose. I too will stop at 20 years of HR experience. I like that, Nessa.
Yeah.
I am certainly passionate about people and culture. I find it really a trying moment in the workplace, and I think mental health and wellness is a topic that has to be discussed, has to be one of our number one priorities to ensure that our people align with organizational goals. When we have healthy people, we have a healthy organization. So I am passionate about all things mental health and people, and really happy to join the panel.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome. And Melissa, welcome.
Hi, I'm Melissa Doman. I'm an organizational psychologist and former therapist and author of this book behind me that my husband forces me to put there. It makes me very twitchy. I specialize in helping companies, leaders, and individuals learn how to have realistic and constructive conversations about mental health at work. The way I tend to approach it is that learning how to talk about mental health at work should be really about conversational literacy and like a skill like any other skill. So I really try to educate organizations on what we're actually talking about, not what they think we're talking about, and really teaching people how to action that education, how to actually have the conversations in addition to understanding its importance. So my clients range from really large organizations like Estee Lauder and Google to mid-sized organizations like Orlando City Soccer Club, Ted Lasso, and small organizations and everything in between. And for companies who are very well behaved at my events, they get the prize of my world famous Chewbacca impression.
Thanks, Melissa. And Michelle.
I would love to see that Chewbacca impression, Melissa.
I think
that would help everybody with their mental health.
For live keynotes in person in front of hundreds of people, because I have no shame. So depending on how active these comment section is at the end, we'll see. We'll see how if anyone asks for it in addition.
That's great. And I'm a huge fan of Melissa. I'm excited to be on this panel with her. Her book is fantastic. So you should read it.
Michelle.
And I love that we have that for leaders in the industry. So I'm Michelle Strasburger, CEO of The Wellness Value. I too, like Angela, am passionate about people and culture. am on a mission to transform cultures to make the world of work a happier and healthier place. I was a victim of workplace bullying. It affected my mental health, but also affected my fertility. So I'm on a mission to change that, and I'm excited to be here today.
Thank you, Michelle. All right, so I'll start on a hopefully pretty easy question. I'm just wondering, why is discussing mental health at work more than just ensuring everybody's happy? So really simple. Who wants to give that one a go?
I'll kick off. Michelle, I saw
Okay.
you on, so feel free to go right after if you'd like. I think the question is, how is it not an important conversation? I like to kind of turn it on its head, because
Yeah.
you spend an inordinate amount of time with people that you work with. And granted, that depends on your work setup, could be anywhere from part-time to working 80 hours a week or something like that. So the thing is that it's always been important, but now the world of work is like, oh, it's actually important. And so I think it comes down to, instead of pretending like things are going to get easier, and I don't mean to sound negative or like a nihilist or anything, but it's only going to get more stressful, and there's a lot more stimuli and more access to technology and information. So why not focus on giving people the space to have those conversations and the tools to actually do it with the people they spend the most time with every single week? And there have been enough articles that have come out, proving that case. But even, for example, between leader and team member, there were a couple of really well-known articles saying that a leader can have as much impact on someone's mental health as a romantic relationship. And when you say that, and people go, "Ooh, I don't know about that," but I think it's at the risk of sounding trite, it's a no-brainer because you spend this much time with people every single week. You can't avoid it anymore. So why not just embed it in the culture so that it comes up as and when it's needed?
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I also think that we have to step away from the belief that this is a process to make people happy. I don't think that's the goal. And I think a lot of times HR initiatives are seen as a kumbaya event and like just bringing people together and making people happy. It's not about making people happy. It's about making sure that they have the ability to balance things, and that we're creating a culture and an organization that allows people to come in when they're not okay and say, I'm not okay today, and to take a break. And I think that's really what it doesn't mean you have to be happy.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Michelle and Melissa have said so far. The one thing that I would add is that I really see a strong link between, psychological safety in the workplace, which has been very much studied, and we've got a lot of great case studies out there about how when a team has psychological safety, how innovation increases, productivity increases, and sure, happiness too. But all of those really tangible things that business leaders want to see. And it really just starts with the foundation of trust. And if we don't see people as a whole person that, includes their physical and mental health, then we're never going to get the best out of them or provide them an experience that really helps them grow.
I think that's so well said by all of you. I also think talking about mental health is critical, because when we look at statistics, so my mind works with data and statistics, but 1 in 5 adults, and this goes back to 2021 study from NIH, 1 in 5 adults suffers from mental illness, mental health issues. Could be anxiety, could be many things on that list. But if we look at that, 61.8% of people in the workforce today from the age of 18 to 49 suffer from mental health issues. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us that the median age as of 2022 is 41.8 years. So that means 61% of everybody in the labor force today has a mental health issue that they're dealing with. So it becomes critical because that's more than half of our workforces, right? And we know that mental health affects more than just the person, it affects the organization as well, right? When it comes in the form of absenteeism, mistakes on the job, outbursts. It could be, the effects are really drastic. So when we look at the amount of people in our workforce today that are struggling, it makes this topic so incredibly important.
Could I chime in to add something to what Angela said? Uh, and this is something I harp on frequently. It's not just these very true and very important stats that you've cited, but it's also just talking about mental health struggles in general. It doesn't necessarily have to be of a clinical nature. So, have we all seen Inside Out? I know there's a sequel coming in June.
Mhm.
Yeah. So there's 4 new characters, one of which is anxiety. I'm very excited since that's my love language. Um, there's a whole spectrum of emotions that we feel, none of which are clinical, and about half of which are really unpleasant. So there's a lot of really negative, intense, non-clinical emotions that we also want to normalize talking about at work, just from the 1-2 punch of daily life. And so I just wanted to add to what you're saying, that in addition to talking about uh, clinical mental health struggles, that we're also normalizing just talking about the full range of emotions that we're given for an evolutionary reason, to let us and others know what's going on in our environment and how to respond. Do we need help? Something like that. And the feeling wheel from Dr. Gloria Wilcox, Willcox, is a wonderful tool, because you have no idea, you as in the royal you, the dozens of emotions we come pre-programmed with out of the box, and they're so far beyond sadness, happiness, disgust, fear, anger, etc. And so I just wanted to add that we're talking about the daily struggle as well.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, everyone. So I'm just moving on to the next question, and I'll start with this for Michelle. So I'll give her some warning. So, can having a tough time with our mental health at work actually help us learn how to work better with others? What do you think about that, Michelle?
I'm gonna stand on the political line and say it depends. Depends where you are. I think as HR professionals, if there's HR professionals in the audience or leaders in the audience, right, you have to take care of your mental health first before you can help others. I think once you get there and you learn the tools and tricks that worked for you, then absolutely it's something you can do. I mean, I told you I went through it when I left the workplace where I was being bullied by my boss. It took me a good 6 months to kind of get my feet back under me and rebuild my confidence. And I think it humbled me as I learned that process, so that I can give space to others. And sometimes you don't learn that until you go through it, right? Because you just assume everything's great, everything's fine. But I also think that mental health isn't a quote unquote problem. I think it's something that we should be practicing every day to be healthy. And I think sometimes there's a stigma. My 13-year-old son, when he was 7, he was going to therapy, and he's like, well, I'm not broken. Why do I have to go to therapy? I'm like, it doesn't mean you're broken, but that's the stigma. And they learn it really young. I don't know why. And I think that's a stigma out there. And we have to kind of reframe mental health as a part of our overall health. And we exercise our bodies and we feed our bodies for overall health. We have to do the same for our mental health.
I love that, Michelle. I'll just chime in on that. I hear a lot of people use the word mental health as something's wrong. So I will hear phrases like, that person has mental health. And I'm left sitting there going, everybody has mental health, So it's about mental illness or the degree to which you have mental well-being. So, even just starting from that baseline of talking about mental health doesn't necessarily imply that something is quote unquote wrong. But yeah, I just wanted to chime in on that point, but I'll pass it on to someone else.
Nessa, I have to tell you, I was like, I'm happy I was muted because I was cackling because I will never forget, there was someone who came up to me after an event that I did. We're talking about the content, and then he leans in and whispers and says, "I have mental health." And I said, "We all do. Are you trying to say you have a mental illness?" He goes, "Oh yeah, that." And it goes so far, just to take it a little extreme for a moment, and trigger warning. I actually spoke to a client at a company who said, I lost my boyfriend to mental health. And so I paused and I said, don't correct her. Say, I'm sorry you lost him to mental illness. That sounds really, really painful. And that's how far it goes, is that just because it's about the same organ doesn't mean they have the same meaning, and it should not be used interchangeably. So a million times, yes.
Yeah.
I completely agree with that. And kind of to piggyback off what Michelle was saying, our own self-awareness and self-love matters, right? Because who we are is how we tend to lead as leaders. So when we have our own mental health and well-being in check, we can then set the example for those around us and what's acceptable, and opening up those discussions for everyone.
Yeah, and sort of moving on from that, I'm just wondering, what are some of the different ways that the companies, leaders can actually help their employees, their workers feel better, actually work on their mental health? What are some things that organizations can actually do? And maybe we'll start with you, Nessa, with this one.
Yeah. So a lot of times I go macro and then go micro, but this time I'm going to start micro and then maybe my colleagues here can go macro. But, I just want to highlight the importance of having one-on-one conversations with people, giving space for people to share what's going on with them, checking in and making sure that they have everything that they need. And honestly, just leaving a little bit of room, however much room you can leave, for how are you? And I have a little trick with that, is that, typically we get, an answer that's very, standard or just sort of empty, I'm fine. But later on, I'll ask the question again, maybe in a different way. How's life? And then that's when I start to get a different sort of answer, or what's on your mind is another good one. So asking twice, I think is a really good thing. But dedicating time to check in with people on an individual level, yes, it takes time, but the results can be very powerful.
I couldn't agree with you more, Nessa, on that. The one-on-ones, I think, are critical. I always encourage team members and leaders, managers, supervisors, to make time for those one-on-ones, because that feeling of being heard is essential for everyone, right? And when you have someone that's authentically checking in and asking you how you're doing, it means a lot to people. It could be the only time that day that someone has asked them, "How are you doing? How are you feeling?" So it's a wonderful thing. From a macro level, I mean, companies need to, our first priority, oftentimes in HR, is to tell the story, right? To make sure that our executives understand how important mental health is, how it impacts the bottom line, how it impacts the people that work for them every day, right? Telling that story, making sure that we're all on the same page. Then we go to making sure that it's offered in health insurance plans, right? Making sure that we have an EAP, or that we're communicating the EAP. And then on a mass schedule, we're looking at using communication as a tool to take the stigma away from having discussions about mental health and how are you doing today, and letting people know it's okay to have a bad day. It's okay if you're not feeling 100% today, because guess what? Every one of us have days like that. Every one of us have days where we struggle, where, the struggle is different for everyone, but normalizing that conversation is critical. We, last but really not least, from an executive level, we have to model the behaviors of showing that it's okay to have these conversations, that it's normal. it's not something that, we're picking someone that we notice has an issue or a performance issue. We're saying, what's wrong? What are you doing? It's not that. We have to model the behavior that everybody, back to Melissa's point, everybody deals with different things on a day-to-day basis. Talking to everybody, having those touch points really opens the door.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I remember starting out in my career a very, very, very long time ago, and we used to train and onboarding like you leave your problems at the door, which now that I'm older and have gone through my career, that's so silly. But that used to be part of our onboarding process, and there was also a fine line of you don't talk about certain things at work. And with leaders too, as you moved into a leadership position, there were even more things you couldn't talk about at work. Like you can't talk about people's personal stuff. And I think we have to train our leaders. I think that's a way we can move into this area in the workplace to have these conversations. And I think Melissa's book, I'm going to keep plugging your book, Melissa, talks about this and how to do it, and the importance of training your leaders. It's okay to have these conversations at work, and it's actually helpful for folks and will drive engagement. And so I think a good place to start is training your leaders on how to have those conversations and how to be authentic and share their own stories too, because I think that helps.
Something
yes, sorry, go on.
No, I just wanted to build on what everyone was saying, and there was actually a comment from someone that I thought was very in line to feed into this, if that's okay. The person was saying, I don't want to be asked how I'm doing. I like being in my space, so I don't like being checked on as it ruins my mood. Must one ask such a question? Can't it be obvious by personality? Isn't that what HR is supposed to do? Now, this person raises a very good point, because for some people, based on personality, based on personal experience, based on culture, or who knows what, some people don't want to be asked. And now the thing is that while there could be really good intention, there are some people that specifically in a work setting will experience being checked in on as intrusive, even though it is completely meant to be a helpful, caring, empathetic thing. Now, to comment on what this person is doing, no, we can't tell based on personality at all, because there could be someone who's extraordinarily quiet and you would never know that maybe they're yearning for someone to check in on them. Or it could be quite the opposite, where someone seems really chatty, very extroverted, and then if they're asked, they go, ooh, no, thank you. So we can never make assumptions about someone's personality, whether or not they want to be checked in on, because you just don't know. And when it comes to, isn't that what HR is supposed to do? I'm always stumping for HR, because there are so many things they're supposed to do. And at the end of the day, they're just people. And based on their job title, they're given a really tough rap about what they're supposed to do, not supposed to do, and be the sun, the moon, and the stars at the same time. So let's also remember that HR folks, while mental health very much sits within that camp, that in my experience, they're trying to do the best they can with what they have. And so I think you just got to give HR like a little bit of a break, because there's so many correlations between HR and clinical mental health. It's staggering in terms of the stuff that they try to help with and what they try to do. So I definitely see your point, but we cannot make assumptions about people who want to be checked in on or not. And there's a massive difference, both interpersonally and legally, by the way, between just asking someone how they're doing in general versus inquiring if they have a clinical mental illness. So big difference. So just wanted to pull that in. I hope that was okay.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you raised some great points there, Melissa, is that, and there's another quote, something else, someone made a point that that often people suffer in silence, and encouraging the talk is really important. And that's certainly been my experience, is with examples that you share where some really outgoing people really have some challenges, and you're really not aware of them, and it's really how do you talk to them, and who is it best to talk to them? It's certainly not always going to be HR or the leader. It can be their mates at work as well. So it's sort of a role for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so if we'll just move on to the next one, and it's probably expanding on this one in a way, is that, and we'll start with you, Melissa. Can you just share a story about when it became easier to talk about mental health at work for yourself? Again, an example is fine.
It's funny you say that because back when I was working in the corporate world, and I don't want to date myself, but it was never okay. It was never okay to talk about it. And I even remember, this sounds awful, working for an employee assistance program. I was an EAP counselor, and talking about our own struggles was actually discouraged in a lot of ways, because when you're in a field of helping other people and you have a license to do that, there's like an unspoken, you have to always be okay so we can trust you to do the job. Talk about ridiculous and toxic and unhealthy, but that's a harangue for another time. But I never really experienced that when I was working in the corporate world. And so while I couldn't experience on a personal level, I think that drove some of my pay it forwardness in the work I do, because I would really only say it became easier. Granted, that's a little subjective and relative. It only started becoming easier probably in the past 5 to 7 years max. Because and it was funny, I was living in London with my husband, and in England, of all places, is where the workplace mental health movement really began. We're talking about it very much socially in the US. We're talking about therapy or medication, like we're talking about the weather. But when it came to the workplace, because the US, generally speaking, has more laws to protect companies than employees. But in the UK, when they used to be part of the EU, in the UK and EU, there are more protections for workers. And so there was more psychological safety and protections, really, to start talking about that in the workplace. And the royal family in the UK started talking about their struggles with depression since Diana passed. And it was just kind of this wave of social permission that went from there. And it just kind of spread. And to be at the center of it was amazing. But for some folks in certain industries and certain companies, it's still not easy. And just because we're seeing movement, we're seeing traction, doesn't mean that ease is felt equally across industries, across companies, even across teams. Because an organization might talk about it, but if you go within it to certain teams, and I'm not exaggerating, this was last year, okay? And this was at a leadership mental health conference where someone said a few weeks ago, my manager said to me, unless someone is dying, I don't want to hear about your mental health. This happened in 2023. So it started becoming easier 5 to 7 years ago, but we have a lot of work still to do.
Yeah.
So I run a group called the HR Rebels, and we had a conversation like this. One of our meetings a few weeks ago, we were talking about the future of HR, and somebody brought up that the future of HR is going to be much more, or the future of the workplace, sorry, not HR, future of the workplace is going to be much more focused on mental health, to the point where employees are going to come and say, these things you're asking me to do is no longer psychologically safe. And for me, that's fantastic. I'm like worried about my kids saying that to me when I ask them to do chores. But I think we have to think about that, and like we can celebrate it and say, wow, that's fantastic that we're going to get there someday. But how do we arm our managers with that? Because then it gets to, well, so are you insubordinate? Are you saying you're not going to do the work? Right? So I think we have to think about how we address that in the future and train our leaders on that.
That's a
Thanks,
great
Michelle.
point, Michelle. When we think about training our leaders, we have to come up with, as companies, those boundaries, right? We have to set boundaries. What is acceptable? What is not acceptable? And we have to ensure that self-awareness and emotional intelligence is something that we are demanding of our leaders.
So maybe building on that one, and I'll start with you, Angela, is why should companies care about mental health and just like they care about the work getting done? So what are some steps that that organizations can take to really help with mental health at work?
Well, great question, Rod. And I think companies need to care about mental health because, our companies are made up of the people that work for us, right? The company is not just a name. The folks that actually push the material or whatever it is that they do out the door are the lifeblood of our company. And when we care about the employees, when we care about their mental health, it gets the job done, right? When people are in a good headspace, when people are happy, when they feel psychologically safe, there are enough studies across the world that show that productivity is higher, absenteeism is less, defects and errors are lower. So that in and of itself is a good reason why companies should care about the mental health of our employees.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say that, I don't think a company can say that they're people centric without a focus on mental health. Mental health is such a big part of who we are as people. And I think that, the power dynamics of work, really do impact, like already set a stage for mental health, in the sense of like, I've got a boss, the boss has shareholders, everyone has a boss. So there's a lot of like dynamics there that are going to impact mental health. So, I think that mental health has to be at the center of a company that is people centric because it's so just fundamental to who we are and how we show up. And even for those that are good at masking what they're going through, I've seen enough examples to see where that just eventually comes to light. Now, it could come to light in like deciding to leave an organization, but if people don't feel heard, and valued, they're not going to stay. So that's why it's important.
Yeah. Also, there was a study done. It's old, but I think it's still relevant. It was done in 2011, which doesn't seem that old, but it's older. And it was a study done by the Patient Health Questionnaire, or looking at the Patient Health Questionnaire 9, which looks at workplace depression and anxiety. And they found that every increase in the PHQ-9 score, there was a 2% decrease in productivity. So for those of you that like data and like to show like this is actually affecting the work that people are doing, I can put that or I'll send it to Rod to put in the comments and share with everybody, because it's really interesting to see, and you can show your leaders, this is why we have to focus on it, because it does affect productivity.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. There's a comment that's mental health is important, but it's personal and should be discussed with a medical physician or a mental health professional. Just wondering, Melissa, if you want to address that comment and make some comments on that.
I do. And the thing is that, to a degree, this person is right. Now, I talk very, very often about the fact that we are not trying to train people to be therapists, psychiatrists, doctors. That's both unhelpful, unethical, and illegal, or all, not both. But the thing is that it's a balance, because yes, as this person is saying, there's time off, there's accommodations, absolutely. However, mental health comes up all the time, and we're not trying to expose. That's a very key word. We're not trying to expose people's mental health. And having these conversations, and I cannot stress this enough, we're trying to create the psychological safety for the option without the obligation to have these conversations. Because until the last few years, it was, we don't want to hear it at all. And we all see how people's mental health is doing. Now more than ever, more people are getting more help. They're seeing more doctors, they're using more tools, they're talking about it more. And yet, our mental health is worse than ever for a whole variety of reasons. And so, there's some conversations that are appropriate for the workplace that do take HIPAA into account, speaking as a former therapist myself who is HIPAA trained. Uh, and there are some conversations that are not appropriate for the workplace. It's very much, it's not, we're not trying to encourage an open playing field or an iron wall. We're trying to encourage a fence where at least certain things can get through, where someone can get accommodation or just let their manager know if something's going on, if they seem different so they don't fill in the blanks, because humans are pattern creating creatures and a lot of things can get lost in the unsaid. But there's also certain conversations, and I talked about this at length in one of my LinkedIn Learning courses, that bringing it up at work where these people are not the right people to help you. You do need to speak to a doctor, you do need to speak to a psychiatrist, but there are ways to, again, through training, which, you know, Michelle has talked about a lot, that you learn how to have supportive mental health conversations with the law in mind, with compliance in mind, and especially from a leader perspective, even if you don't work in HR, if someone discloses a mental health condition to a leader, there is then a legal compliance process that they have to follow to make sure that health information is protected. So I wanted to just comment on what you're saying, that it's very much it's a fence sort of situation, but we are not trying to expose people's mental health. We're trying to make them feel like they have the option without the obligation to bring it up. And I hope that's a helpful addition to your important comment.
That's really well said, Melissa, and I can
Thank
definitely
you.
chime in as HR leadership. You know, we are trained in what conversations we can have, what we can't. We are trained in, you know, what discussions need to take place when something is disclosed. And truly, the thought behind having those conversations with our team members and employees is really, it's about empathy, right? It's about caring. It all goes back to knowing that every one of us wants to be heard. If you see someone and they're not looking like they're doing okay, it's never wrong to say, hey, how you doing? You doing okay? Check in on people, right?
No, absolutely. So true. Okay, so we'll just move on to the next one and next question. And I've sort of covered this in a number of panels in the last month, and it always brings fascinating aspects. And that is, I'm just curious on how we see different generations in the workplace sort of deal with mental health. Do you see it treated differently? And I'll start with Michelle with that one.
Yes, I think we could do a whole hacking HR on the generational differences, because there's a lot there that you have to unpack. I think different generations definitely handle mental health differently. We were brought up, I was brought up, and, you know, anytime we talked about emotions, my mother would cry, like we just never talked about it. And the same thing in the workplace. And I think also being a female, there's an unwritten code of, you know, you can't cry in the workplace because you're not seen as strong enough. So I think there's generational differences. I also think there's differences between male, female, and other races too, and other diversity factors, and how we address mental health. I'll give you a great example. Like my older son is 13. Like I said, we went to the doctors and they wanted to test him for mono because he was really sick. He's better now. But when they put the tourniquet on his arm, he doesn't remember ever having blood drawn. His hand started turning blue, and he looked at the nurse and he said, my anxiety is really spiking right now. and he's 13. He's going to take that with him in the workplace and say, he's going to be able to have those conversations. And I'm not just saying this is something my son is really good at. That's the generation we're bringing to the workplace in the future. And they're comfortable talking about their emotions and what's going on. And that's going to be very different than even just my generation. And then you have, the boomers that are still in the workplace, and they, we're just going to do hard work and get the work done and go home. And we don't talk about emotions. So I think there is definitely a generational gap. And the same thing, like between male, female. I had a executive once, she was a female, getting presentations together. The CFO and CEO were in the room with her. I was in the room, and she started crying. And her mom was sick, or something happened with her mom, and she had all this pressure at work. And so she just broke down, and they did the right thing in the moment and said, okay, what can we do? How can we help? Then the CEO came in my office and said, she's not going to cut it. She's not strong enough. And those are the things, like, you could give her a break. She can come back and do a better job on the presentation, versus like firing her because she cried at work. And I think we have to understand the differences, not just in generations, but in every diversity aspect that people bring to the table.
I relate to a lot of what you said, Michelle, because, I grew up in a Mexican-American family. I have two different distinct cultures that I belong in, but largely grew up in a Mexican-American home. And talking about mental health is just like so foreign to my family. And in recent years, I've been talking to my family more and more about my own struggles. They're uncomfortable with it, but, I think, they're coming along. Unfortunately, we lost the matriarch of our family 3 weeks ago. And it was just really good to be in that environment with them, even though we were under like terrible circumstances. But, when you have language, you're able to start to use it. So I would say for anybody who's feeling uncomfortable with this topic, just start by learning about what emotions are and like definitions from scientists who study emotions. And the book that I would plug is Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown. I learned a lot about emotions through reading that book, and the approach that she took was very research oriented. But anyway, I say all of that to say that the newer generation is just more comfortable talking about it, but we have a shared commonality that we all experience these things. So it's just about how we show up. It's just another level of diversity. Some of us are going to be like, I need to talk about this and put this all out on the table. And others are going to say, I want to talk about that in private or not at all. So we just have to meet people where they are.
So true. So just moving on to the next little question, and I'll ask this one of Angela. I'm just, HR are not immune to mental health challenges, and I'm just wondering, what are some of the best ways to support HR personnel with their mental health?
So that truer words, Rod, could not be said. So I know personally, I am no different than anybody else. I can get anxious at work, right? When you have a million things up in the air. One of the things that I do regularly with my teams are just constantly checking in. How are you? What are you feeling? I encourage a very open and honest discussion in my group. I believe that, having those discussions and keeping it real, right? There's a difference between a manager coming in and saying, okay, well, have we completed, talent reviews? Have we completed, and how did they go, right? Versus, hey, how's everything going? Is the work on your plate manageable right now? How did the conversation with X go today, right? Really digging in and asking your team how they're doing and checking in is really the best barometer. But I think being an empathetic leader, especially in HR, is critical, right? Because we often think about, the entire organization, right? We almost feel like the moms or the dads of the organization. How's everybody feeling? What can we do to address engagement and everything like that? But it starts with our own team, right? Because you can't pour from an empty bucket. So I think talking to your team often about what's going on and asking the question, how can I help? I mean, making sure that folks know that my office, I tell everybody who walks into my office, this is a space that is safe. This is a space where you can vent. You can tell me anything you want. It's going to stay here. And let's work through it. Let's just chat. Let's see what we can do, right? Creating that safe space for your HR team, I think, is critical. It will give them the tools that they need to do their job.
Could I add to what Angela said? In addition to that, I cannot stress this enough that HR is often held responsible to facilitate the mental health conversation in an organization. They need to be able to join it themselves and to humanize themselves beyond their HR title to the rest of the organization, because of that job title, people make an assumption that HR is always fine or has to be fine so they can be the perpetual supporter for everybody else. So I'm always encouraging HR folks that being able to, within reason and comfort, self-disclose if they're struggling too, because just because they're struggling doesn't mean they can't do the job. So not only do you want to have those conversations within the team, but also reminding other people that your department is literally made up of the same creatures as everybody else in that company, and to stop treating them otherwise.
I agree completely with that, Melissa. That vulnerability is key.
Yeah, honesty. Oh my God, just be honest.
Exactly.
Like, it doesn't matter that I'm the director of HR. I struggle too.
Exactly.
And one of different functions.
One of the biggest and most liberating things is saying, hey, guess what? I get anxious too. Even though my title is director, I get anxious too, and it's okay.
Yes, I think that's huge. I think it's harder in an organization where the psychological safety isn't there. When we're talking about mental health really mattering at work, if your HR professional can't say time out, I'm having a bad day, because they're afraid they're going to get fired, you need to take a really hard look at your culture. I also think HR professionals just naturally, and I've done it myself, we take it all on, right? We put it all on our shoulders and we feel like we have to do it all and we have to be the superhero of the organization. Angela said the moms and dads of the organization. I think we do. And it's okay. We don't have to. We're not supposed to be carrying it all. And I would say find your allies, link arms with other people at your level across the organization to help take some stuff off your plate. Talk to your leader or your CEO about prioritization. There are a lot of things that, and it just can be as simple as do you need me to do that? Or do you need me to focus on recruiting? Which is more important? I think there's a lot of things that we don't necessarily need to do that we feel we need to do, and it burdens us. And then also for the HR departments of one, I think the weight is also heavier. So find your personal board of directors inside or outside the organization, your friends and stuff that you can have that, because HR can be a lonely place. And you need those people to help just get rid of that stress on your shoulders.
I think HR is a really lonely place, and we just have to face the fact that we're not going to often find the support that we need inside of the organization just based on the nature of our role. So pro tip to all the HR professionals out there, if you are seeing a therapist, have the therapy appointment on Monday evenings, because it's the best way to start your week. I actually just did that by happenstance. And every time I'm talking to my therapist on a Monday evening, it's sort of this is the best idea ever. So pro tip.
I need to start using that, because I see my therapist midweek. I need to do it in the beginning of the week. What a good idea. That's wonderful.
Well, I think that like having done so many of the hacking HR panels, there's so many empathetic people in hacking HR. Just look out for some mentors from hacking HR, because some certainly amazing people, including the ones on the panel right now. So just moving on to the next question, and I might start you with this one, is what are some misunderstandings people might have about mental health in the workplace?
Well, beyond, the first one that we talked about, which is like mental health, everybody has mental health. I think it's like that, people see it as weakness, so, I think that it's not a weakness. It's simply what we're going through at the time. Would you call having a cold a weakness? Would you call having a long-term illness a weakness? No, you would say that that's a part of your identity, and it's how you show up and how you have to navigate the world around that. I also think in the workplace, mental health often gets addressed with take some time off. Well, you're going to come back to work, and if the workload's going to be the same and the dynamics on the team are the same, the culture's the same, not a lot is going to change. You just got a chance to catch your breath. And there was a while during the pandemic where, a lot of us felt like the weekend was simply for decompressing. Finally, you decompress by Sunday evening just to go back at it again. So, I think, that's really important, is just remembering that.
I think that's huge. And companies will say, well, we have mental health days, mandatory mental health days throughout the year, 1 or 2. I think those are great. But I don't think that's it, right? It needs to be really intentional and a well thought out strategy on how you're addressing mental health, and 2 mental health days a year is not enough.
Now, we've only got 9 minutes left. This is just crazy. This conversation could go for so long, but we just move on to the next little question, and we'll come to Melissa for this one. Is if someone doesn't feel comfortable talking about their mental health, what are some ways that they can get support, or you can offer support for them?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to talking about mental health in general, it can feel scary or uncomfortable, especially in an environment where there can be potential inappropriate consequences, if we're being honest. So I think that it's really about making sure that folks in an organization, going back to that other person's comment earlier, that we're trying to create the psychological safety for folks to feel like they can talk about it, while also understanding that not everybody wants to do that in the same way. So having a very strong organizational message that there are lots of different ways to accomplish that goal based on personal comfort. So if you don't want to talk about it at work, and also very quickly, I saw in one of the comments that someone kindly was asking, well, why can't we just have group therapy at work? Because it would be very sticky, unethical. I can't comment on whether or not that's legal, but there's too many ways for it to go wrong. And there's too many ways that it could get sticky, potentially weaponized. And that's actually one of the reasons that I don't recommend that there are in-house therapists at companies, because that there will be some manager that if they are having a difficult time managing someone not understanding, that they'll mandate that they go see the therapist down the hall. There are too many ways for it to go wrong. Even though it sounds good in theory and concept, it's too sticky. So just letting people know that if you don't want to talk to a manager or someone in HR, speaking as a former EAP therapist myself, that's literally on-demand counseling from a licensed clinician, and it's available 24/7. There are shifts that counselors cover. So an EAP is phenomenal. Going to see a therapist if you can get in to see one, because it's long waits, unfortunately, and more therapists are not taking insurance, and I get that, having been a therapist before myself who did take insurance. Or even just there's some people that want to use technology or tools to help themselves with mental health. We're going to see a therapist might feel too scary, so they might want to start with some kind of self-help apps or more anonymous platforms, but really just encouraging people that if you don't want to have a direct conversation at work, that's fine. But you have to find something that works for you, because if you are struggling and feel that the traditional ways of reaching out for getting help aren't for you, it doesn't absolve you of the responsibility to find what does. So I would just be very clear to the organization that there's a buffet of options, but you're responsible to choose what works for you.
Thanks, Melissa. Anyone want to add on to that?
She said it perfectly.
She did.
Can you be my hype woman on the road, Michelle?
I know.
I'll be your groupie.
My first groupie.
I'm gonna
Yay.
call you M&M together. M&Ms.
I love it.
All right, so we only have 5 minutes left. Crazy. So I guess as we probably have the last question as we wrap up, and maybe we'll go around the whole group. Just if you want to just share one or two things that that managers can do right after this, after the panel, to help improve their workplaces and mental health. What are your thoughts on the couple of most important things?
I will kick us off. So I think one is like, start with yourself, like,
Thanks.
brush up on your emotional literacy. We've mentioned a few different books here. So, I would take the time to sort of understand the common emotions in the workplace and how they show up. And then secondly, I would take a look at your calendar as a leader, if you're a leader, and think about who are my the key people that I work with, and how am I checking in with them? Do I have the system set up to automatically sort of have these natural check-ins with them? And then maybe even just as simple as checking in with your folks, and trying a new question when you have a check-in with them, how's life? How are you feeling instead of how are you doing? That's a very different question, So yeah, those are my 2 tips.
I'll follow that
Thanks.
up. I completely agree with the self-awareness. Definitely something that all of us as managers should be routinely doing. But I also would encourage everyone, what we can take from this is really to look at what our expectations are of our teams and of our people, to make sure that we're not inflexible, make sure that we are looking at people and recognizing, struggles. Make sure that we remove obstacles. We forget that as leaders, that's our biggest job, right? We remove the obstacles for our people to succeed. Those would be my pieces of advice.
I'll go
Thanks,
after
Angela.
that. So one quick thing, and then I separately wanted to clarify a very important question folks had in the comments. But I think the one thing that managers can do, starting today, and I've recommended this a lot in the past, is sometimes it's helpful for a team to talk about, well, what would be helpful for our team to check in about mental health. Actually making your team understand that they have input in that process, and that the manager can make some guesses about what would be helpful, but actually having a conversation with the team saying, I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert to know what you all need. And granted, I can't meet the expectations of every person exactly the way that they want, but what would good support look like in our team from a group level, an individual level, not putting people on the spot to have that answer, but just to start thinking about that, because there can even be kind of a collective agreement on how mental health can be treated in that team. Now, granted, that's not super hard and fast. There are exceptions, but then it really feels collectively decided on. And yes, if you think about it, it's a smaller ecosystem within the larger ecosystem of an organization. But I think that in general, the average person wants to be heard, and they want to feel like they have an opinion in that process. So I think having either a open, candid conversation about that, or encouraging people to come to you one-on-one with some ideas, more anonymously. I have some exercises in my book on how to do that. Michelle was plugging in enough. I thought maybe I should say one thing. But yeah, just make them feel involved in the process, so you're not dictating it. The separate thing I wanted to comment on when we were talking about not doing group therapy in the workplace, someone here was mentioning when it stress debriefing, which is actually through your employee assistance program. So if there is a traumatic event that happens at the workplace or is somewhere in the company, it's not that someone inside the company is going to facilitate that. They would literally have clinicians come in a time box fashion to provide a critical incident stress debriefing in response to a traumatic event that a company has experienced. But that's really the only case when it's appropriate.
Awesome. I have just a couple of things. One, I would say be authentic and share your story. One of the books I've read recently, not necessarily in the workplace mental health, but just around mental health in general, was Oprah's book, What Happened to You? And in there, they quote that about 60% of people have had at least one traumatic experience in their lifetime. And they thought that number was underreported. So everybody's got a story, share it. And that starts to open the gates so that people feel comfortable sharing it. I would say too, we get familiar with the languages that around mental health, and Melissa talks about this in her book too. But I learned a lot from that, where, you know, we say things like, oh my gosh, my week is so crazy, right? And then that I've really become much more intentional about changing the language so that I'm not normalizing something that is much more important, and not making somebody feel left out. So I think those are the two main things that I would do.
Well, thank you, Nessa, Angela, Michelle, and Melissa. A great conversation. We've learned today taking care of your mental health is super, super important for doing well at work and making a workplace a supportive environment. So I hope everybody's found today a helpful discussion, and I look forward to seeing you at future Hacking HR panels. So thanks, everybody. So say goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye,
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.